It's already over. And most people just haven't realized it yet because the collapse did not arrive like a storm that announces itself. It crept in quietly while everyone was distracted, while people were arguing about surface level issues, while narratives were being pushed and repeated until they felt like reality. And now the consequences are here in full view, not as a sudden shock, but as a slow tightening pressure that people are only now starting to feel in their daily lives, in their finances, in their relationships, and in the silence where something used to exist but no longer does. And by the time most people fully understand what is happening, there will be nothing left to fix because the habits, the expectations, and the behaviors will have already shifted too far to easily reverse. If you are enjoying these Angry Guy videos and you want to support the work, you can buy me a Red Bull with a one-time gift or support monthly using the link in the description because it allows these discussions to stay direct, honest, and unfiltered in a way that is becoming increasingly rare. For a long time, men and women operated within an unspoken agreement that most people never questioned because it was simply the way things were. And that agreement was built on a balance of roles and expectations where men provided, pursued, and protected, while women contributed in different but equally important ways that created a functioning system. And while it was never perfect and never free from conflict, it had enough stability that people could build lives around it, raise families within it, and depend on it as a framework that gave structure to both personal relationships and broader society. And that stability existed because both sides, whether they admitted it or not, depended on each other in ways that made cooperation not just beneficial, but necessary. Then that balance began to shift, not gradually in a way that allowed for adjustment, but rapidly through cultural messaging, economic changes, and social pressure that all moved in the same direction at the same time. And women were told repeatedly that they did not need men for protection, for provision, for emotional support, or for stability, and that independence was not just an option, but the ideal, and that reliance on men was something to be avoided or even looked down upon. And this message was reinforced across media, across education, across social platforms, and across everyday conversations until it became normalized to the point where questioning it felt unnecessary. And while all of this was happening, men were absorbing these messages, not always reacting immediately, but taking note of the shift in expectations and the shift in how they were perceived. And here is where things take a turn that people still seem surprised by, even though it is the most predictable outcome imaginable, because men listened to what they were being told, and instead of fighting endlessly against a system that was redefining their role in ways that often placed them at a disadvantage, they began to withdraw, not in a loud or confrontational way, but quietly, steadily, and with increasing consistency as more and more of them reached the same conclusion that the cost of participation was no longer worth the return, and that engaging in relationships under these new conditions carried risks that outweighed the potential benefits. And this withdrawal did not happen overnight, but built momentum over time until it reached a point where its effects became visible. Now, you have a situation where women are openly expressing financial struggles in ways that were less visible before. And you have stories of events where large numbers of women show up expecting the same dynamics that used to exist, only to find that the men are not there in the numbers they expected. And this is not about isolated incidents, but about a pattern that is emerging across different contexts. And what makes this pattern significant is not just the absence itself, but what that absence represents, because it signals a change in behavior that is being repeated on a larger scale. At the same time, the cost of living continues to rise, and the economic environment is becoming more difficult for individuals to navigate on their own. And this is where the social and economic factors begin to intersect in a way that amplifies the impact of both, because independence, while appealing in theory, becomes much harder to maintain when the financial pressure increases and the support systems that people relied on, whether they acknowledge them or not, are no longer present in the same way. And this creates a situation where the burden of survival shifts entirely onto the individual. And that burden can become overwhelming when there is no one else to share it with. What we are seeing now is not just a financial strain, but a realization that certain forms of support were more integral than people recognized, and that relationships beyond the emotional and social aspects also functioned as systems of shared resources, shared responsibilities, and shared resilience. And when those systems are removed or weakened, the individual is left to carry everything alone, and that is a heavy load, even under stable conditions, let alone in a time of rising costs and increasing uncertainty. The reaction to the situation is complex, but it often manifests as frustration and confusion, because from one perspective, it feels like something that was once available has been taken away, while from another perspective, it feels like a withdrawal from a system that no longer offered fair or predictable outcomes. And this difference in perspective creates a disconnect that makes meaningful conversation difficult, because each side is interpreting the same events through a completely different lens. And without a shared understanding of the underlying causes, discussions tend to circle around blame rather than solutions. Men who have stepped away are not necessarily doing so out of indifference, but out of a calculated decision that the risks associated with participation have increased while the benefits have become less certain. And this calculation is influenced by a combination of financial considerations, social expectations, and personal experiences that collectively shape how they view relationships. And when enough individuals reach the same conclusion independently, their actions begin to form a broader trend that is difficult to ignore. As more men choose to focus on their own stability, their own financial security, and their own peace of mind, they are less inclined to engage in situations that they perceive as unpredictable or one sided. And this shift in priorities reflects a broader change in how value is assessed, where the emphasis is placed on minimizing risk and maximizing personal control rather than pursuing outcomes that depend heavily on external factors. And once this mindset takes hold, it becomes self reinforcing, because the benefits of stability and independence become more apparent over time. Meanwhile, the economic pressure continues to build, and the expectation that external systems or institutions will provide sufficient support becomes less reliable as resources become more constrained. And this creates a scenario where individuals must rely more heavily on their own capabilities and less on external assistance. And for those who previously depended on a combination of personal relationships and institutional support, this transition can be particularly challenging, because it requires a complete adjustment in how they approach both their finances and their expectations. The intersection of these factors is what is driving the current situation. And it is important to understand that this is not the result of a single cause, but the convergence of multiple trends that have been developing over time. And when these trends align, their combined effect is much greater than the sum of their individual impacts, because they reinforce each other in ways that accelerate the overall shift. What we are witnessing is the early stage of a new equilibrium that has not yet fully formed, where old patterns are breaking down faster than new ones are being established. And this creates a period of instability where outcomes are uncertain and adjustments are ongoing. And during this period, individuals are forced to adapt in real time, often without clear guidance or precedent. And those adaptations, once established, become the foundation for future behavior. As this process continues, the changes that seem unusual today will become normalized, and what was once considered a deviation will become the standard. And this is how societal shifts solidify over time, not through sudden transformation, but through the gradual accumulation of individual decisions that collectively reshape the landscape. The challenge with reversing such shifts is that they require not only a change in external conditions, but also a change in internal perceptions. And both of these are difficult to achieve once a new pattern has been established, because people tend to resist returning to previous states if they have adapted to a new one that they perceive as more stable or more aligned with their interests. This is why the current trajectory is significant, because it is not just about the present moment, but about the direction in which things are moving. And if the underlying factors remain unchanged, the trend is likely to continue, leading to further adjustments in how people form relationships, manage their finances, and structure their lives. Understanding this dynamic is crucial, because it allows you to see beyond the immediate reactions and recognize the broader pattern that is unfolding. And once you see that pattern, it becomes clear that the situation is not temporary, but part of a longer term shift that will continue to evolve as conditions change and as individuals continue to adapt to those changes. The key takeaway is that behavior follows incentives. And when the incentives change, behavior changes with them. And right now, the incentives that once supported traditional relationship dynamics are no longer aligned in the same way. And until they are realigned, the current trends will persist, regardless of how people feel about them or how strongly they wish for a different outcome. This is not about assigning blame or taking sides, but about recognizing the reality of how systems function and how they respond to changing conditions. And once you understand that, you can begin to see why things are unfolding the way they are and what that means for the future, not just for relationships, but for the broader structure of society as a whole. And that is the wake up call, not as a dramatic statement, but as a straightforward observation of where things are heading based on the patterns that are already visible. And the sooner you recognize it, the better prepared you will be to navigate what comes next. Because ignoring it does not stop the change from happening. It only delays your awareness of it until the consequences are harder to manage and the options available to you are more limited than they would have been if you had adapted earlier. When you look at the situation without emotion and without the noise that comes from social media reactions, what you begin to see is not chaos, but a pattern that follows a very simple logic. And that logic is rooted in human behavior, responding to incentives, because people do not operate in a vacuum and they do not make decisions randomly. They adjust based on what they experience, what they observe, and what they believe will lead to the best outcome for themselves. And when enough individuals start adjusting in the same direction, the result is a shift that feels sudden from the outside, but is actually the accumulation of many small decisions made over time. One of the most important things to understand here is that men did not all come together and decide to walk away as part of some coordinated effort. There was no meeting, no agreement, no organized movement in the traditional sense. But what happened instead was something far more powerful, which is independent convergence, where individuals who do not know each other arrive at the same conclusion because they are responding to similar conditions. And when that happens on a large scale, it creates a wave that is difficult to stop, because it is not being driven by a central force that can be negotiated with or persuaded. It is being driven by countless personal calculations that all point in the same direction. At the individual level, a man looks at his experiences. He looks at what he has seen happen to others. He looks at the expectations placed on him, and he weighs the potential benefits against the potential costs. And if that equation does not make sense, he adjusts his behavior accordingly. And when that adjustment leads to a better outcome in terms of peace, financial stability, or personal control, it reinforces the decision, making it less likely that he will return to the previous behavior. And when this process repeats across thousands, then millions of individuals, it creates a new norm that did not exist before. What makes the situation particularly significant is that the reinforcing loop is very strong, because once a man steps away and experiences a reduction in stress, an increase in financial stability, or simply a sense of control over his own life that he did not have before. That experience becomes a reference point, and it changes how he evaluates future decisions because he is no longer comparing his options to an abstract idea of what a relationship could be. He is comparing them to a tangible experience of independence that has already proven itself to be beneficial in his own life. At the same time, the information environment plays a role because people are more connected than ever, and they share their experiences, their observations, and their conclusions in ways that amplify these patterns. So, a man who might have been uncertain about his own experience now sees that others have reached similar conclusions, and that validation strengthens his position, not because he is being influenced in a superficial way, but because he sees that his experience is not isolated and that there is a broader trend that supports his decision. On the other side, the same amplification is happening, but with a different emotional tone, because as the effects of this shift become more visible, the reaction includes confusion and frustration. And that reaction is also shared and amplified, creating a feedback loop that intensifies the perception of the problem without necessarily providing a clear path to a solution. And this is where the disconnect becomes even more pronounced because each side is reinforcing its own perspective through the information it consumes and shares. When you combine this with economic pressure, the situation becomes even more complex because financial stress does not just add to the problem, it accelerates it. And it does so by increasing the urgency of decisions. Because when resources are limited, people are less willing to take risks, and relationships, particularly in their early stages, are inherently uncertain. They require investment without guaranteed return. And in a stable economic environment, that uncertainty is more tolerable because the baseline level of security is higher. But when that baseline erodes, the tolerance for risk decreases and people become more cautious. This is particularly relevant when you consider the role that shared resources have historically played in relationships, because while the emotional and social aspects are important, the practical aspect of sharing expenses, sharing responsibilities, and creating a combined unit that is more resilient than the individual is a significant factor. And when that factor is removed or weakened, the cost of maintaining a relationship increases because each individual is now carrying more of the burden independently. And this changes the calculation for both sides. For men who have already stepped away, the increased cost of re entering the system becomes another deterrent because not only do they have to give up the stability they have built, but they also have to take on additional financial and emotional risk in an environment that is already challenging. And unless there is a clear and compelling reason to do so, they are likely to continue prioritizing their current position because it has already proven to be effective in meeting their needs. For women who are experiencing the impact of both economic pressure and the absence of traditional support structures, the situation can feel increasingly difficult because the expectations that were shaped during a different set of conditions no longer align with the current reality. And adjusting those expectations requires not just a change in behavior, but a change in mindset. And that process can be slow and uncomfortable, particularly when it involves acknowledging that certain assumptions no longer hold true. This is where the concept of adaptation becomes critical, because every significant shift requires individuals to adjust their strategies. And those who adapt more quickly tend to navigate the transition more effectively, while those who resist the change or rely on outdated models may find themselves struggling. And this is not a judgment, but an observation of how systems evolve over time, because change does not wait for everyone to be ready, it continues regardless of individual readiness. As this transition continues, you begin to see secondary effects that extend beyond the immediate context of dating and relationships, because changes in how people form partnerships influence other areas of life, such as housing, spending patterns, and long term planning. And these effects can compound over time, creating new challenges and new opportunities depending on how individuals respond. For example, An increase in people living alone can lead to higher individual costs for housing and utilities because economies of scale are lost. And this can further increase financial pressure, which in turn influences other decisions, creating a chain reaction that extends across multiple aspects of life. And when these patterns occur on a large scale, they can have broader economic implications because they affect demand, consumption, and overall stability. At the same time, the reduction in traditional family formation has implications for demographics because lower birth rates can lead to changes in population structure over time. And while these effects are not immediate, they are significant in the long term because they influence workforce dynamics, economic growth, and social support systems. And these are not abstract concepts, but real factors that shape the trajectory of a society. Despite these broader implications, much of the conversation remains focused on immediate experiences and reactions, which is understandable because those are the most visible and emotionally impactful aspects. But to fully understand what is happening, it is necessary to step back and consider the larger picture because the patterns we are seeing are not isolated events, but interconnected processes that influence each other. One of the challenges in addressing this situation is that there is no single solution that can resolve all of these factors at once because the issues are multifaceted, involving cultural norms, economic conditions, and individual behaviors. And each of these elements operates on a different timeline, making it difficult to coordinate changes in a way that produces immediate results. And this complexity can lead to frustration because people often look for simple answers to problems that are inherently complex. Another challenge is that trust, once eroded, is difficult to rebuild. And trust is a fundamental component of any cooperative system, whether it is a relationship, a community, or a broader social structure. And when trust declines, people become more cautious, more guarded, and less willing to engage in situations that require vulnerability. And rebuilding that trust requires consistent, reliable experiences over time, which cannot be rushed or forced. This is particularly relevant in the context of relationships because trust is not just about individual interactions, but about the overall perception of fairness, stability, and predictability within the system. And if those elements are perceived as lacking, individuals are less likely to participate regardless of their personal desires because the perceived risk outweighs the potential benefit. And as a result, the current situation can be seen as a recalibration period where old models are being tested against new conditions. And those that do not hold up are being replaced by alternative approaches. And while this process can be disruptive, it is also a natural part of how systems evolve because they must adapt to changing environments in order to remain functional. The key question moving forward is not whether change will occur, because it already is, but what form that change will take and how individuals will position themselves within that new framework, because those who understand the direction of the shift and adjust accordingly are more likely to find stability, while those who rely on previous assumptions may find themselves increasingly out of alignment with the reality around them. This is why awareness is so important, because recognizing the patterns early allows for proactive adjustment rather than reactive response. And proactive adjustment tends to produce better outcomes because it involves deliberate decision making rather than decisions made under pressure. And in a situation where multiple factors are changing simultaneously, the ability to anticipate and adapt becomes a significant advantage. At the same time, it is important to acknowledge that not everyone will experience the shift in the same way because individual circumstances vary, and factors such as location, income, social networks, and personal preferences all influence how these broader trends manifest at the individual level. And while the overall pattern is clear, the specific impact will differ from person to person. However, the existence of variation does not negate the overall trend, because even if some individuals are less affected, the aggregate effect across the population still drives the broader shift. And this is why it is important to distinguish between individual anecdotes and systemic patterns, because focusing too heavily on exceptions can obscure the underlying dynamics that are shaping the overall trajectory. As we continue to move through this period of transition, it is likely that new norms will begin to emerge, and these norms may differ significantly from those that existed before, because they will be shaped by the current conditions rather than the conditions of the past. And while it is difficult to predict exactly what form they will take, it is clear that they will reflect the changes that have already occurred. For those who are paying attention, this is an opportunity to reassess priorities, to evaluate what is truly important, and to make decisions that align with both current realities and future possibilities. Because while the situation may be challenging, it also creates space for new approaches and new ways of structuring life that may be more resilient in the face of ongoing change. Ultimately, what we are witnessing is a transformation that is still in progress. And like any transformation, it involves a period of uncertainty, adjustment, and realignment. And while that process can be uncomfortable, it is also a reminder that systems are not static. They evolve in response to the conditions around them. And understanding that evolution is the first step toward navigating it effectively. The next phase of the shift will likely involve further adjustments as individuals continue to respond to both social and economic pressures. And as these responses accumulate, they will shape the new equilibrium that eventually replaces the old one. And while that equilibrium may not resemble what existed before, it will represent a new balance that reflects the realities of the current environment. And those who understand this process will be better equipped to adapt and thrive within it. As this shift continues to unfold, one of the most important things to understand is that people tend to underestimate how permanent behavioral changes can become once they are reinforced over time, because there is an assumption that when conditions improve or when pressure builds on one side, things will naturally revert back to how they were before. But that assumption ignores how human psychology works. Because once someone has adjusted to a new way of living that provides them with stability, control, and predictability, they do not easily abandon that for something that previously caused them stress, uncertainty, or loss. And this is especially true when the new behavior has been reinforced through repeated positive outcomes. For many men who have stepped away from traditional dating and relationships, the change was not just about avoiding negative experiences, it was also about discovering an alternative way of living that felt more aligned with their goals. And that discovery is significant because it creates a new baseline. And once that baseline is established, the previous way of operating is no longer seen as the default. It becomes an option that must be justified. And if that justification is not strong enough, there is no incentive to return to it, regardless of external pressure or expectations. This is where the concept of inertia becomes relevant, because behavior that is repeated consistently becomes easier to maintain over time, and the longer it is maintained, the more difficult it becomes to change. And when you apply this to a large number of individuals simultaneously, it creates a collective inertia that resists reversal, not because people are unwilling to change under any circumstances, but because the conditions required to motivate that change are no longer present in the same way they once were. At the same time, the narrative surrounding relationships has not fully adjusted to reflect this new reality. And this creates a disconnect between expectation and outcome, because many people are still operating under the assumption that the dynamics of the past are still in effect, even though the behavior on the ground has shifted. And this mismatch leads to confusion and frustration, because actions that would have produced a certain response in the past no longer produce the same response. And without an understanding of why that is happening, it can feel like something is broken without a clear explanation. This is particularly evident in situations where traditional signals and expectations are no longer being reciprocated because the absence of response is often interpreted as rejection or indifference, when in reality, it may simply be the result of a different set of priorities guiding behavior. And this misinterpretation can lead to escalating reactions because each side is responding to a version of reality that is not fully aligned with the other. As these misunderstandings accumulate, they contribute to a broader sense of disconnect because communication becomes less effective when the underlying assumptions are not shared. And without effective communication, it becomes difficult to address the root causes of the issue, leading to a cycle where symptoms are discussed without resolving the underlying dynamics that are driving them. Another factor that contributes to the persistence of this shift is the role of habit formation. Because once individuals establish routines that support their current lifestyle, those routines create a structure that reinforces the behavior. And disrupting that structure requires effort, motivation, and a compelling reason to do so. And in the absence of such a reason, the path of least resistance is to continue with the established routine, particularly when it is producing satisfactory results. This is why appeals that rely solely on emotion or nostalgia are unlikely to be effective, because they do not address the practical considerations that are driving behavior. And while they may resonate on a superficial level, they do not provide a sufficient incentive to overcome the inertia that has been built over time. And without addressing the underlying incentives, attempts to encourage change are likely to have limited impact. At the same time, the economic environment continues to play a critical role in shaping behavior because financial stability is a foundational concern that influences a wide range of decisions. And when that stability is threatened or uncertain, individuals tend to prioritize actions that protect their resources and minimize risk. And this often leads to more conservative decision making, particularly in areas that involve uncertainty or potential loss. In the context of relationships, this means that individuals may be more cautious about entering into situations that could have financial implications, whether directly or indirectly. And this caution is amplified by the perception that the costs associated with relationships have increased, whether through rising expenses, increased expectations, or potential legal and social risks. And when these factors are taken into account, the decision to step back can appear rational from a purely practical standpoint. As more individuals adopt this cautious approach, it reinforces the broader trend because each individual decision contributes to the overall pattern. And as the pattern becomes more visible, it influences the expectations and behavior of others, creating a feedback loop that sustains the shift. And this is how changes that begin at the individual level can scale to become societal trends. Another aspect to consider is the role of identity and self perception, because changes in behavior are often accompanied by changes in how individuals see themselves. And for many men who have stepped away from traditional roles, there is a redefinition of identity that places greater emphasis on independence, self reliance, and personal development. And this new identity can be a source of pride and satisfaction, further reinforcing the decision to maintain the current path. This redefinition is important because identity is a powerful motivator. And once individuals align their behavior with a particular sense of self, they are more likely to continue that behavior in order to maintain consistency. And this makes it even more difficult to revert to previous patterns that no longer align with that identity, because doing so would require not just a change in behavior, but a change in self perception. On the other side, there is also a process of adjustment taking place as individuals reassess their expectations and explore alternative strategies for navigating the current environment. And this process can involve a range of responses from seeking new forms of support to reevaluating priorities and making changes to lifestyle and spending habits. And while this adjustment can be challenging, it is also a necessary part of adapting to changing conditions. And as this adaptation continues, it is likely that new forms of interaction and cooperation will emerge because the need for connection and support does not disappear even when traditional structures change. And individuals will find ways to meet those needs within the constraints of the current environment, whether through different types of relationships, new social networks, or alternative arrangements that reflect the realities of the situation. However, these new forms may differ significantly from what existed before, because they will be shaped by the current set of incentives and constraints. And this means that expectations will need to adjust accordingly, because attempting to apply old models to new conditions is unlikely to produce satisfactory results. And recognizing this is an important step in navigating the transition effectively. One of the key challenges during this period is managing the emotional response to change, because uncertainty and disruption can create stress and anxiety. And these emotions can influence decision making in ways that are not always aligned with long term interests. And developing the ability to maintain on in a clear perspective in the face of these pressures is an important skill that can help individuals make more informed and deliberate choices. This involves focusing on what can be controlled, such as personal finances, personal development, and the quality of one's own decisions, rather than becoming overly focused on external factors that are beyond individual control. And while this may seem straightforward, it requires discipline and awareness, particularly in an environment where information and opinions are constantly being shared and amplified. As the situation continues to evolve, it is also important to recognize that change does not occur uniformly across all areas. And there will be variations in how different communities and groups experience and respond to these trends. And understanding these variations can provide additional insight into how the broader pattern is developing and where potential opportunities or challenges may arise. For example, in some areas, there may be a greater emphasis on rebuilding local support networks or creating alternative forms of community that provide some of the benefits that were previously associated with traditional relationships. And these efforts may take different forms depending on the specific context, but they all reflect an attempt to adapt to the changing environment in a way that maintains a sense of connection and support. At the same time, there may be continued resistance to change in other areas where individuals hold on to previous expectations and attempt to navigate the current environment using outdated models. And while this may provide temporary comfort, it can also lead to increased frustration if the expected outcomes are not achieved because the underlying conditions have shifted. This highlights the importance of flexibility and willingness to adapt, because those who are able to adjust their expectations and strategies in response to changing conditions are more likely to find effective solutions, while those who remain fixed in their approach may find it increasingly difficult to achieve their desired outcomes. And this is a common pattern in any period of transition. Another factor that will influence the trajectory of the shift is the role of broader economic and policy changes, because external conditions can either reinforce or alter the incentives that drive behavior. And while individuals cannot control these factors, they can influence how they respond to them. And staying informed about these developments can provide valuable context for decision making. For example, changes in housing markets, employment opportunities, or social policies can have a direct impact on individual circumstances. And understanding these changes can help individuals anticipate potential challenges or opportunities and adjust their strategies accordingly. And this proactive approach can make a significant difference in how effectively one navigates the transition. As we look ahead, it is clear that the current situation is part of a larger process of transformation that will continue to unfold over time. And while the exact outcome is not predetermined, the direction of change is influenced by the patterns that are already visible. And recognizing these patterns provides a foundation for understanding what may come next. This does not mean that the future is fixed or that there is no room for variation. But it does mean that certain trends are more likely to continue unless there is a significant shift in the underlying factors that are driving them. And being aware of this allows individuals to make more informed decisions about how they position themselves in relation to these trends. Ultimately, the key to navigating this period is not to resist change or to rely on the assumption that things will return to a previous state, but to engage with the reality of the current environment and to develop strategies that are aligned with that reality. And this requires a combination of awareness, adaptability, and a willingness to reassess assumptions in light of new information. By doing so, individuals can move from a reactive stance to a proactive one, where they are not simply responding to changes as they occur, but actively shaping their own path within the evolving landscape. And while this does not eliminate uncertainty, it provides a greater sense of control and direction, which can be valuable in a time of ongoing transformation. And this is where the deeper understanding comes into play, because once you see the patterns, once you recognize the incentives, and once you understand how behavior responds to those incentives, you're no longer caught off guard by the changes that are taking place. You are prepared for them. And that preparation is what allows you to navigate the situation more effectively than those who are still trying to make sense of what is happening after the fact. As the shift deepens, what becomes increasingly clear is that we are not just looking at a change in behavior, but a change in expectations. And expectations are far more powerful than most people realize because they shape how individuals interpret reality, how they respond to challenges, and what they believe is possible or acceptable within a given system. And when expectations are built on a set of conditions that no longer exist, the resulting mismatch creates tension that cannot be resolved until those expectations are adjusted to align with the new reality. For a long time, there was an assumption that certain dynamics would always be available, that certain roles would always be filled, and that certain outcomes could be relied upon without much consideration for the underlying conditions that made those outcomes possible. And this assumption created a sense of stability that allowed people to plan their lives with a degree of confidence. But that stability was contingent on a balance that has since been disrupted. And when that balance shifts, the assumptions built on it become less reliable. This is where the concept of delayed recognition becomes important, because changes in systems are not always immediately visible. And there is often a period where the old expectations continue to influence behavior, even as the conditions that supported them have already changed. And during this period, individuals may continue to operate as if nothing has shifted, only to encounter outcomes that no longer match their expectations. And this can lead to confusion and frustration because the cause of the discrepancy is not immediately apparent. As more people begin to recognize that the old patterns are no longer producing the same results, there is a gradual adjustment in expectations, but this adjustment does not happen uniformly or at the same pace for everyone. And this creates a landscape where different individuals are operating with different assumptions, which can further complicate interactions because each person is responding based on their own perception of reality rather than a shared understanding. In practical terms, this means that interactions that were once straightforward now require a greater degree of interpretation and negotiation because the implicit rules that guided behavior are no longer universally accepted or understood. And this increases the complexity of social interactions, making them more unpredictable and, in some cases, more stressful because the outcomes are less certain and the margin for misunderstanding is higher. At the same time, the role of personal responsibility becomes more pronounced because as traditional support structures weaken, individuals are required to take on a greater share of the responsibility for their own outcomes. And this shift can be empowering for those who are prepared to handle it, but it can also be challenging for those who are accustomed to relying on external support because it requires a different set of skills, a different mindset, and a willingness to take ownership of decisions and their consequences. This increased emphasis on personal responsibility is closely tied to the broader economic environment because financial independence is a key component of being able to navigate a system where shared resources are less readily available. And as the cost of living continues to rise, the importance of managing finances effectively becomes even more critical because the margin for error decreases and the consequences of missteps become more significant. For individuals who are able to adapt to this environment, there is an opportunity to build a level of resilience that was not as necessary under previous conditions. And this resilience can provide a sense of stability and confidence that is valuable in a time of uncertainty. But for those who struggle to adapt, the same conditions can lead to increased stress and a sense of being overwhelmed because the demands of the environment exceed their current capacity to respond. This divergence in outcomes highlights the importance of adaptability because the ability to adjust to changing conditions is a key factor in determining how individuals experience the transition. And those who are able to recognize the shift early and make the necessary adjustments are more likely to find themselves in a position of relative stability. While those who delay or resist adaptation may find themselves facing greater challenges as the gap between expectation and reality widens. Another aspect of this shift that deserves attention is the role of time, because changes in behavior and expectations do not occur in isolation. They unfold over time, and the longer a particular pattern persists, the more entrenched it becomes. And this has implications for how quickly or easily the system can adjust to new conditions, because deeply ingrained patterns are more resistant to change than those that are relatively new or less established. This is particularly relevant when considering the potential for reversal, because while it is possible for conditions to change in ways that alter the incentives and encourage different behavior, the process of reversing a well established pattern is often more difficult than the process of establishing it in the first place, because it requires not only a change in external conditions, but also a shift in internalized habits and beliefs that have been reinforced over time. In the context of relationships, this means that even if economic conditions improve, or if there is a shift in social narratives, the behavior that has developed during this period may not immediately revert to previous patterns because individuals have already adapted to a different way of operating, and that adaptation has become part of their routine and their identity. And changing it would require a compelling reason that outweighs the benefits they currently experience. As a result, the future of relationships is likely to be shaped by a combination of continuity and change, where some elements of the past persist while others are replaced by new approaches that reflect the current environment. And this hybrid state may look very different from what existed before, because it will incorporate the lessons and adaptations that have emerged during this period of transition. One of the potential outcomes of this process is the emergence of more clearly defined expectations. Because as individuals navigate the uncertainty of the current environment, there may be a greater emphasis on establishing clear agreements and boundaries in order to reduce ambiguity and manage risk. And this could lead to a shift away from implicit assumptions toward more explicit communication about roles, responsibilities, and expectations. This shift toward clarity could have both positive and negative effects, because on one hand, it can reduce misunderstandings and create a more predictable framework for interaction. But on the other hand, it may also reduce the flexibility and spontaneity that were part of previous dynamics. And finding a balance between these elements will be an ongoing challenge as new norms develop. Another potential development is the diversification of relationship models, because as traditional structures become less dominant, individuals may explore alternative arrangements that better suit their preferences and circumstances. And this could lead to a wider range of relationship types that coexist within the same society, each with its own set of norms and expectations. And this diversity could provide more options for individuals to find arrangements that align with their needs. However, this diversification also introduces additional complexity because it requires individuals to navigate a broader range of possibilities and to make more deliberate choices about what they want and what they are willing to accept. And this can be both empowering and challenging because it increases the degree of agency, but also the responsibility for making informed decisions. As these changes continue to unfold, it is important to maintain a long term perspective because while the immediate effects may be disruptive, the longer term outcome will depend on how individuals and societies adapt to the new conditions. And this adaptation will involve a combination of trial and error, learning and adjustment as people experiment with different approaches and refine their strategies over time. In this context, the ability to learn from experience becomes particularly valuable because those who are able to reflect on what works and what does not, and to adjust their behavior accordingly, are more likely to navigate the transition successfully, while those who repeat the same patterns without adapting may find themselves facing recurring challenges. This process of learning and adaptation is not limited to individuals. It also occurs at the societal level, where norms and institutions evolve in response to changing conditions. And while this process can be slow, it is an essential part of how systems maintain functionality over time because it allows them to adjust to new realities and to incorporate new information into their structure. As we consider the broader implications of this shift, it is also important to recognize that change often creates opportunities as well as challenges, because new conditions can open up possibilities that were not available under previous circumstances. And those who are able to identify and take advantage of these opportunities can benefit from the transition in ways that may not be immediately obvious. For example, the increased emphasis on independence and self reliance can lead to the development of skills and capabilities that enhance personal growth and resilience. And these qualities can be valuable not only in the context of relationships, but in other areas of life as well, such as career development, financial management, and personal well being. At the same time, the recognition of the importance of connection and support may lead to new forms of community and collaboration that provide some of the benefits that were previously associated with traditional relationships. And these new forms may be more flexible and adaptable to the current environment, allowing individuals to meet their needs in ways that are better aligned with their circumstances. Ultimately, the outcome of this transition will depend on how individuals and societies respond to the challenges and opportunities that arise. And while it is not possible to predict every detail, it is clear that the patterns we are seeing now are shaping the trajectory of that outcome. And understanding these patterns provides a foundation for making informed decisions about how to navigate the path forward. This is why it is important to approach the situation with a combination of realism and adaptability, because recognizing the reality of the current conditions allows for more effective planning and decision making, while adaptability provides the flexibility needed to adjust as those conditions continue to evolve. And together, these qualities can help individuals navigate the transition with greater confidence and resilience. As the process continues, there will likely be further developments that add new layers of complexity to the situation. And staying informed and engaged with these developments will be important for maintaining an accurate understanding of the landscape because the ability to respond effectively depends on having a clear and up to date view of the factors that are influencing the system. In the end, what we are witnessing is not an isolated phenomenon, but part of a broader pattern of change that reflects the interaction between social, economic, and individual factors. And while the specifics may vary, the underlying dynamics are consistent with how systems evolve over time. And understanding those dynamics is key to navigating the transition effectively and positioning oneself for the future that is taking shape. As this transformation continues to unfold, one of the deeper layers that begins to surface is how much of what people believed to be natural behavior was actually conditioned by environment, incentives, and repeated reinforcement. Because when those external conditions change, behavior that once seemed automatic starts to shift in ways that feel unnatural at first. And this creates a sense of disorientation because people are not just adapting to new circumstances, they are also realizing that many of their previous assumptions were tied to a specific set of conditions that no longer exist in the same form. This realization can be uncomfortable because it challenges the idea that certain dynamics are fixed or inevitable, and instead reveals that they are influenced by factors that can change over time. And when those factors change, the behavior that emerges can be very different from what people expect. And this is exactly what we are seeing now, where actions that once seemed predictable are becoming less so, and outcomes that were once common are becoming less frequent. In this environment, individuals are forced to reassess not only their strategies, but also their understanding of how the system works. Because relying on outdated assumptions can lead to repeated disappointment. And this reassessment requires a level of honesty that can be difficult to maintain because it involves acknowledging that some of the expectations that guided previous decisions are no longer valid, and that continuing to operate under those expectations may not produce the desired results. This is where the concept of recalibration becomes central, because in order to function effectively within a changing system, individuals must adjust their internal models to match external reality. And this process is not always straightforward because it involves both cognitive and emotional adjustments. And while the cognitive aspect involves understanding the new dynamics, the emotional aspect involves accepting them. And the latter can often be more challenging because it requires letting go of familiar patterns and expectations. As this recalibration takes place, it becomes clear that the current situation is not simply a temporary disruption, but part of a broader shift in how value is perceived and exchanged, because relationships, like any other system, are influenced by the perceived value that each party brings and the balance of that value over time. And when the perception of value changes, the behavior within the system changes as well. For men who have stepped away, the perception of value has shifted in a way that prioritizes autonomy, stability, and control over the traditional benefits associated with relationships. And this shift is not just about avoiding negative experiences, it is also about recognizing the opportunity cost of engaging in situations that may not provide a sufficient return on investment. And this calculation becomes more pronounced in an environment where resources are limited and the stakes are higher. At the same time, the perception of value on the other side is also undergoing adjustment because as the conditions change, the expectations that were built on previous dynamics may no longer align with what is currently available. And this misalignment creates a gap that must be addressed in order for interactions to become more effective. And addressing that gap requires a willingness to reevaluate what is being offered and what is being expected in return. This process of reevaluation is not something that happens instantly because it involves both individual and collective shifts in perspective. And these shifts are influenced by a wide range of factors, including personal experiences, cultural narratives, and economic conditions. And as these factors continue to evolve, they will shape the direction of the recalibration in ways that may not be immediately predictable. One of the challenges during this period is that there is no single source of authority that can define the new norms because the system is decentralized and influenced by the actions of many individuals rather than a central governing body. And this means that the new equilibrium will emerge organically over time as patterns of behavior stabilize and become more widely accepted. And this organic process can be messy and uneven because it involves experimentation, adjustment, and sometimes conflict as different approaches are tested and refined. As part of this process, there is likely to be an increased emphasis on transparency and accountability because in an environment where trust has been challenged, Individuals may seek to establish clearer expectations and to hold each other accountable for meeting those expectations. And this could lead to more explicit agreements and a greater focus on ensuring that both parties are contributing in ways that are perceived as fair and balanced. However, this shift toward greater clarity and accountability also requires a higher level of communication and self awareness because individuals must be able to articulate their needs, their boundaries, and their expectations in a way that is both clear and reasonable. And this can be a skill that takes time to develop, particularly for those who are accustomed to relying on implicit understanding rather than explicit discussion. As these new communication patterns develop, they may help to reduce some of the misunderstandings that have contributed to the current disconnect, but they will also require individuals to take a more active role in managing their interactions because the responsibility for establishing and maintaining clarity will rest more heavily on the individuals involved rather than on shared assumptions. Another aspect of this shift is the changing role of social validation, because in the past, certain behaviors and choices were reinforced by social norms and expectations, and deviating from those norms could carry a social cost. But as the norms themselves change, the sources of validation also change, and individuals may find that the approval they once sought from others is no longer aligned with their current priorities, leading them to place greater emphasis on internal validation and personal satisfaction. This shift toward internal validation can be empowering because it allows individuals to make decisions based on their own criteria rather than external expectations. But it also requires a strong sense of self awareness and confidence because without external reinforcement, individuals must rely on their own judgment to determine what is right for them. And this can be challenging in an environment where there is a wide range of opinions and perspectives. As individuals navigate this landscape, there is also the potential for increased polarization because different groups may adopt different strategies and perspectives based on their experiences and priorities. And this can lead to a divergence in how people approach relationships and interactions, with some groups emphasizing independence and self reliance, while others seek to rebuild or maintain traditional structures. And this divergence can create additional complexity in interactions because individuals may encounter others who are operating under very different assumptions. Despite this complexity, it is important to recognize that change also creates opportunities for growth and innovation. Because as old models become less dominant, there is space for new ideas and approaches to emerge. And those who are willing to explore these possibilities may find solutions that are better suited to the current environment. And this willingness to innovate can be a key factor in adapting successfully to the changing landscape. For example, individuals may develop new ways of forming connections that do not rely on traditional frameworks, or they may find ways to collaborate and share resources in ways that are more flexible and adaptable. And these new approaches may not look the same as what existed before, but they can still provide meaningful support and fulfillment if they are aligned with the needs and realities of the individuals involved. At the same time, there is a need for caution because not all new approaches will be effective or sustainable, and part of the adaptation process involves distinguishing between what works and what does not. And this requires a willingness to learn from both successes and failures and to adjust strategies accordingly. And this iterative process is a natural part of how systems evolve over time. As we move further into this period of transition, it is likely that the pace of change will vary depending on external conditions. And factors such as economic stability, technological developments, and cultural shifts will all play a role in shaping the trajectory. And staying aware of these factors can provide valuable context for understanding how the situation is evolving and what it may mean for the future. Ultimately, what is taking place is a reconfiguration of how individuals relate to each other within a changing environment. And while this process can be challenging and at times uncomfortable, it is also an opportunity to build systems and relationships that are more aligned with current realities and more resilient in the face of future changes. And those who are able to engage with this process thoughtfully and proactively are more likely to find stability and fulfillment as the new equilibrium takes shape. The key to navigating this transformation is to remain grounded in reality while maintaining the flexibility to adapt as conditions evolve, because the ability to balance these two aspects allows individuals to make informed decisions without becoming rigid or resistant to change. And this balance is essential in a landscape where certainty is limited and adaptability is a critical asset. As the transition continues, the patterns that are currently emerging will become more defined, and the new norms will begin to solidify. And while this process may take time, it will eventually lead to a new state of equilibrium that reflects the cumulative effects of the changes we are witnessing now. And understanding this process provides a framework for interpreting what is happening and for making decisions that are aligned with the direction in which things are moving. In the end, the situation we are observing is not an anomaly, but a manifestation of how systems respond to changing conditions. And while the specifics may be unique to this moment, the underlying principles are consistent with broader patterns of change and adaptation. And recognizing these principles allows for a deeper understanding of the dynamics at play and a more effective approach to navigating the path forward. As the situation continues to evolve, another layer begins to reveal itself. And that layer has less to do with immediate behavior and more to do with long term consequences that are only now starting to form in the background. Because when large groups of people change how they relate to each other, the effects do not stop at the surface level of dating or individual interaction. They ripple outward into the structure of everyday life, into how communities are formed, how stability is maintained, and how people plan for the future. And these ripple effects often take time to fully materialize, which is why many people underestimate their significance until they are already deeply embedded. One of the first areas where this becomes visible is in how people begin to think about long term commitments. Because when the foundation of trust and mutual expectation is uncertain, individuals become more cautious about making decisions that tie them to another person in a way that limits their flexibility. And this caution is not irrational, it is a response to an environment where outcomes are less predictable and where the cost of making the wrong decision is perceived to be higher. And as a result, people may delay or avoid commitments that were once considered standard milestones. This delay has a cascading effect because long term commitments often serve as anchors that provide structure to other aspects of life, such as housing, financial planning, and career decisions. And when those anchors are absent or postponed, individuals may adopt a more fluid approach to these areas, prioritizing short term stability and adaptability over long term planning. And while this approach can be effective in managing uncertainty, it can also lead to a sense of instability because there is less of a fixed framework to rely on. And at the same time, the absence of traditional commitments changes how individuals allocate their resources, both in terms of time and money, because without the expectation of building a shared future, there is less incentive to invest in long term joint ventures, and more emphasis is placed on personal goals and immediate needs. And this shift in resource allocation can influence broader economic patterns because it affects consumption, savings, and investment behavior across a population. Another area where the impact becomes evident is in the way people experience social connection, because traditional relationships often served as a primary source of companionship and support. And when those relationships become less common or less stable, individuals may need to seek alternative forms of connection. And this can lead to changes in how social networks are formed and maintained, with a greater emphasis on friendships, community groups, or other forms of association that provide some of the benefits that were previously associated with romantic partnerships. However, these alternative forms of connection may not fully replicate the depth or consistency of traditional relationships, and this can create a gap that individuals must navigate, because while they may have access to a broader range of social interactions, the level of support and commitment may differ. And managing this gap requires a level of awareness and intentionality in how one builds and maintains these connections. In addition to these social and economic effects, there is also a psychological dimension to consider, because changes in how people relate to each other can influence how they see themselves and their place in the world. And when traditional roles and expectations shift, individuals may need to redefine their sense of identity and purpose in ways that align with the new environment. And this process can be both challenging and transformative, because it involves letting go of certain assumptions and embracing new possibilities. For some, this redefinition can be empowering, because it allows for greater autonomy and the opportunity to pursue goals that may not have been prioritized under previous conditions. And this can lead to a sense of fulfillment that comes from self directed growth and achievement. But for others, the same process can be disorienting, because it removes familiar reference points and requires the development of new ones. And this can create a period of uncertainty as individuals search for a new sense of direction. As these individual experiences accumulate, they contribute to a broader cultural shift, because the way people think about relationships, commitment, and personal fulfillment begins to change. And these changes are reflected in the narratives that are shared through media, conversations, and social platforms. And over time, these narratives can influence how future generations approach these topics, creating a feedback loop that reinforces the new norms. This generational aspect is particularly important, because younger individuals who are coming of age in this environment may not have the same reference points as those who experienced previous dynamics. And as a result, their expectations and behavior may be shaped by the current conditions rather than by historical norms. And this can accelerate the shift, because it reduces the influence of older patterns and increases the adoption of new ones. At the same time, there is likely to be a period of overlap where different generations operate under different assumptions. And this can create additional complexity in interactions, because individuals may have different expectations based on their experiences and the context in which they develop their understanding of relationships. And navigating this overlap requires a level of awareness and flexibility to accommodate these differences. Another factor that will influence the trajectory of this shift is the role of technology, because advancements in communication, entertainment, and work have already changed how people interact and how they structure their lives. And these changes can both support and reinforce the current trends, because they provide alternatives to traditional forms of interaction and allow individuals to meet certain needs without relying on the same structures that existed in the past. For example, remote work and digital communication can reduce the need for physical proximity and allow individuals to maintain independence while still engaging with others. And this can make it easier to sustain a lifestyle that prioritizes autonomy, because the barriers to doing so are lower than they were in previous generations. And this technological support can further entrench the behavioral patterns that are already emerging. However, technology also introduces new challenges, because it can create a sense of connection that may not fully replace the depth of in person interaction. And it can contribute to a sense of isolation if not balanced with other forms of engagement. And managing this balance is an important aspect of navigating the current environment, because relying too heavily on one form of interaction can limit the range of experiences and support available. As we consider the broader implications of these developments, it becomes clear that the current shift is not just about relationships, but about how individuals and societies adapt to changing conditions. And this adaptation involves a combination of maintaining certain elements that continue to function effectively while replacing those that no longer align with the environment. And this process is ongoing, with each stage building on the previous one as new information and experiences are integrated. One of the key questions moving forward is how these changes will influence the overall stability of the system, because stability depends on the ability of individuals and institutions to coordinate effectively and to provide a framework that supports consistent and predictable outcomes. And when traditional coordination mechanisms weaken, there's a need for new mechanisms to emerge that can fulfill a similar role, and the effectiveness of these new mechanisms will play a significant role in determining how stable the system becomes over time. In this context, the role of individual decision making becomes even more important because each person's choices contribute to the overall pattern. And while no single decision will determine the outcome, the aggregate effect of many decisions will shape the direction in which the system moves. And this highlights the importance of making informed and deliberate choices that are aligned with both personal goals and the realities of the environment. As the transition continues, it is also likely that there will be periods of adjustment where the system experiences tension or instability as new patterns are tested and refined. And these periods are a natural part of the process because they provide feedback on what works and what does not. And while they can be challenging, they also serve as opportunities for learning and improvement. For individuals navigating this landscape, the ability to remain adaptable and to continuously reassess their approach will be a key factor in achieving stability and success. Because the environment is not static, and the strategies that are effective at one point in time may need to be adjusted as conditions change. And maintaining a mindset that is open to learning and adjustment can help individuals stay aligned with the evolving reality. At the same time, it is important to recognize that not all aspects of the previous system will disappear, because certain elements may continue to function effectively and may be incorporated into the new equilibrium. And this blending of old and new can create a hybrid system that retains some familiar features while introducing new ones, and understanding how these elements interact can provide additional insight into how the system is evolving. Ultimately, what we are witnessing is a complex process of change that involves multiple layers of interaction, from individual behavior to societal norms. And while the full outcome is still unfolding, the patterns that are emerging provide valuable information about the direction of the shift and the factors that are driving it. And by paying attention to these patterns, individuals can position themselves to navigate the transition more effectively and to make decisions that are aligned with the realities of the current environment. This is not a situation that can be resolved quickly or easily because it involves deep structural changes that take time to stabilize. But it is a situation that can be understood and navigated with a clear perspective and a willingness to adapt. And those who approach it with this mindset are more likely to find a path that provides both stability and fulfillment as the new equilibrium continues to take shape. As this process continues to stretch forward, another dimension begins to surface that people often overlook until it becomes unavoidable. And that dimension is the way in which sustained shifts in behavior begin to reshape not just outcomes, but expectations about what is normal. Because what starts as an adjustment eventually hardens into a baseline. And once something becomes a baseline, it is no longer questioned in the same way. It is simply accepted as the way things are. And that acceptance has a powerful effect on how future decisions are made. When enough individuals operate under a new baseline for long enough, the memory of the previous state begins to fade. Not completely, but enough that it loses its influence over day to day decision making. And this is particularly important when considering how quickly cultural norms can evolve when reinforced by consistent behavior. Because even if there is resistance at first, repetition has a way of normalizing what once felt unusual. And over time, that normalization becomes self sustaining. In this context, the current shift is not just altering behavior in the present, it is laying the groundwork for what future generations will perceive as standard. And this is where the long term implications become especially significant because individuals who grow up in an environment where certain patterns are already established are more likely to adopt those patterns without questioning them, simply because they do not have a direct reference point for how things used to be. This generational transition has the potential to accelerate the changes we are seeing because it removes the friction that comes from trying to reconcile old expectations with new realities and instead allows new expectations to form organically based on the conditions that are present at the time. And this can lead to a more rapid stabilization of the new equilibrium, even if that equilibrium looks very different from what existed before. At the same time, this process also creates a divergence between those who experienced the previous system and those who did not. And this divergence can influence how different groups interpret the same situation because their reference points are not the same. And this can lead to differences in perspective that are not easily reconciled, particularly when each group views its own experience as the default or the standard. As these differences become more pronounced, they can contribute to a broader fragmentation in how people approach relationships and social structures because there is no longer a single dominant model that everyone follows. And instead, there are multiple approaches that coexist, each shaped by different experiences and priorities. And this multiplicity can create both opportunities and challenges because while it allows for greater flexibility and choice, it also requires individuals to navigate a more complex landscape. In such an environment, clarity becomes increasingly valuable because the absence of a shared set of assumptions means that individuals must be more explicit about their intentions, their expectations, and their boundaries. And this can lead to more deliberate and conscious interactions, but it also requires a higher level of communication and self awareness because misunderstandings are more likely when assumptions are not aligned. At the same time, the importance of consistency becomes more pronounced. Because in a system where trust has been challenged, individuals are more likely to evaluate others based on their actions over time rather than on initial impressions or stated intentions. And this places a greater emphasis on reliability and follow through because these qualities become key indicators of whether an interaction is worth continuing. As these dynamics take shape, the criteria that individuals use to evaluate potential relationships may shift, with greater emphasis placed on factors that contribute to stability and predictability, and less emphasis on factors that are perceived as uncertain or transient. And this shift in criteria can influence how people present themselves and what they prioritize in their interactions. Another aspect of this transformation is the way in which risk is perceived and managed, because in an environment where outcomes are less certain, individuals may adopt strategies that are designed to minimize exposure to potential negative consequences. And this can lead to more cautious behavior, particularly in situations that involve significant personal or financial investment. And while this caution can reduce risk, it can also limit opportunities, creating a trade off that individuals must navigate. This trade off is not new, but it becomes more pronounced in a context where the perceived cost of mistakes is higher. Because when the margin for error is small, individuals are less willing to take chances. And this can influence not only personal decisions, but also broader patterns of behavior. Because when enough people adopt a cautious approach, it can slow down the formation of new connections and reduce the overall level of engagement within the system. At the same time, there may be a countervailing trend where some individuals respond to uncertainty by seeking out new forms of engagement that offer different types of value. And this can lead to the emergence of niche communities or alternative frameworks that provide a sense of connection and support within a more controlled or predictable environment. And these niches can serve as testing grounds for new ideas and approaches that may or may not gain broader acceptance over time. As these parallel trends develop, the overall landscape becomes more varied, with different segments of the population adopting different strategies based on their preferences, experiences, and circumstances. And this variation can make it more difficult to generalize about the system as a whole because there is no single pattern that applies uniformly across all contexts. And understanding this complexity requires a willingness to look beyond simple narratives and to consider the nuances that characterize different situations. In addition to these social dynamics, there is also an economic dimension that continues to influence behavior because financial considerations remain a central factor in decision making. And as economic conditions evolve, they can either reinforce or alter the incentives that drive behavior. And this interplay between social and economic factors is a key component of how the system adjusts over time. For example, changes in income levels, employment opportunities, or the cost of living can directly impact how individuals approach relationships because these factors influence both the resources available and the perceived risks associated with different choices. And when economic conditions are challenging, individuals may prioritize stability and self preservation, while in more favorable conditions, they may be more open to taking risks and exploring new possibilities. This dynamic means that the trajectory of the current shift is not fixed, but is influenced by a range of external factors that can change over time. And while the patterns we are seeing now provide insight into the direction of the shift, they do not determine the final outcome because that outcome will depend on how these factors interact and how individuals respond to them. As we consider the potential future, it is important to recognize that change often occurs in stages, with periods of rapid adjustment followed by periods of consolidation. And during the consolidation phase, the patterns that have emerged are tested and refined, and those that prove to be sustainable are more likely to persist, while those that do not may fade or be replaced by alternative approaches. This process of testing and refinement is essential for the development of a stable equilibrium because it allows the system to adapt to new conditions while maintaining functionality. And while it can be disruptive in the short term, it contributes to the long term resilience of the system by ensuring that it is aligned with the realities of the environment. For individuals navigating this process, the ability to remain flexible and to adjust their approach based on feedback is a key factor in achieving positive outcomes because the environment is not static, and the strategies that are effective at one point may need to be modified as conditions change. And this requires a mindset that is open to learning and willing to adapt. At the same time, it is important to maintain a sense of direction because while flexibility is valuable, it must be balanced with a clear understanding of one's goals and priorities. And this balance allows individuals to make decisions that are both responsive to the current environment and aligned with their long term objectives. And achieving this balance is an ongoing process that requires reflection and adjustment. As the transition continues, there will likely be moments of clarity where the emerging patterns become more visible and easier to understand. And these moments can provide valuable insight into how the system is evolving and what it may look like in the future. And paying attention to these signals can help individuals anticipate changes and position themselves accordingly. At the same time, there will also be periods of uncertainty where the direction of the shift is less clear. And during these periods, it is important to focus on what can be controlled and to avoid making decisions based solely on speculation or fear, because uncertainty can lead to reactive behavior that may not be aligned with long term interests, and maintaining a steady approach can help mitigate this risk. Ultimately, what we are witnessing is a dynamic process of change that is reshaping how individuals interact and how systems function. And while the specifics of this process are complex, the underlying principles are consistent with how systems respond to changing conditions. And understanding these principles provides a foundation for navigating the transition effectively. The key takeaway is that change is not something that happens to people, It is something that people participate in through their decisions and actions. And while individuals may not be able to control the broader forces at play, they can influence how those forces affect their own lives by making informed and deliberate choices. And this agency is an important aspect of navigating any period of transformation. As the new equilibrium continues to take shape, it will reflect the cumulative effect of these choices. And while it may not resemble what existed before, it will represent a new configuration that is adapted to the current environment. And understanding this process allows individuals to engage with it more effectively and to find ways to achieve stability and fulfillment within the evolving landscape. And that is where the real understanding begins. Because once you see that this is not a temporary disruption, but a structural adjustment, you can stop waiting for things to return to a previous state and start focusing on how to operate within the current one. And that shift in perspective is what allows you to move from reacting to the changes to actively navigating them with intention and awareness. As this long arc of change keeps unfolding, another subtle but powerful shift begins to take shape. And that shift is in how people measure success in their personal lives. Because for a long time, success was tied closely to milestones that involve partnership, family formation, and shared progression through life stages. And while those milestones still exist, their influence is weakening in a world where the pathways leading to them are less stable and less predictable. And when the pathways change, the definition of success often follows. This redefinition does not happen all at once, and it does not happen in a uniform way. But gradually, individuals begin to place more weight on metrics that they can control directly, such as financial independence, personal freedom, skill development, and the ability to maintain stability without relying heavily on external factors. And as more people adopt these metrics, they begin to shape the broader cultural understanding of what it means to be doing well. And this in turn influences the decisions that others make. What is interesting about this shift is that it creates a feedback loop because as more individuals prioritize independence and self sufficiency, the systems that once supported interdependence weaken further. And this makes independence not just a preference, but a necessity, reinforcing the behavior that led to the shift in the first place. And this is how structural changes become self sustaining over time. At the same time, this new definition of success brings with it both advantages and trade offs, because while independence can provide a sense of control and resilience, it can also lead to a reduction in shared experiences and collective support. And balancing these outcomes becomes an important consideration for individuals as they navigate their choices, because focusing too heavily on one aspect can lead to gaps in another. This balance is particularly relevant when considering the role of fulfillment, because fulfillment is not a single dimension, it encompasses a range of factors, including personal achievement, social connection, emotional satisfaction, and a sense of purpose. And as the structure of relationships changes, individuals must find new ways to achieve this balance, often by combining elements from different areas of their lives in ways that align with their circumstances. For some, this may involve investing more heavily in career or personal projects, finding meaning in the pursuit of goals that are not tied to traditional relationship structures. And this can be a source of significant satisfaction, particularly for those who value autonomy and self direction. But for others, the absence of certain forms of connection may create a sense of incompleteness that requires alternative solutions. This is where creativity and adaptability play a role, because individuals may need to explore new ways of building connection and support that do not rely on traditional frameworks. And this can include forming stronger friendships, participating in community activities, or creating networks that provide mutual assistance in a way that reflects the realities of the current environment. And while these approaches may differ from what existed before, they can still offer meaningful benefits if they are cultivated intentionally. As these new forms of connection develop, they may also influence how people think about commitment, because commitment is not limited to romantic relationships. It can take many forms. And as individuals explore different ways of structuring their lives, they may find value in commitments that are more flexible or that serve specific purposes. And this diversification of commitment can contribute to a more varied and adaptable social landscape. At the same time, the evolution of these dynamics is likely to influence how individuals approach risk and reward in their personal lives. Because when the traditional pathways are less certain, the evaluation of potential outcomes becomes more complex, and individuals may place greater emphasis on minimizing downside risk while still seeking opportunities for growth and fulfillment. And this can lead to more calculated decision making that prioritizes sustainability over short term gains. This approach to decision making can have broader implications because it influences how people allocate their resources, how they plan for the future, and how they respond to opportunities. And when these decisions are made at scale, they contribute to shifts in economic and social patterns that extend beyond individual experiences, shaping the environment in which future decisions are made. Another important aspect of this shift is the role of perception, because how individuals interpret the changes around them influences their response, and perception is shaped by a combination of personal experience, information sources, and social context. And as these factors evolve, so too does the way people understand and engage with the system. And this can lead to differences in how the same situation is approached by different individuals or groups. For example, some may view the current changes as a challenge that requires adaptation and innovation, while others may see them as a loss that needs to be addressed or reversed. And these differing perspectives can influence behavior in significant ways because they shape the goals that individuals pursue and the strategies they use to achieve them. And understanding these perspectives can provide insight into the diversity of responses that emerge within the system. As these responses interact, they create a dynamic environment where different approaches are tested and refined. And over time, patterns begin to emerge that reflect what is effective under the current conditions. And these patterns can inform future behavior, both at the individual level and at the collective level, contributing to the development of new norms and expectations. In addition to these social and psychological factors, there is also a structural component to consider, because institutions and systems that were designed to support previous dynamics may need to adapt to remain relevant. And this adaptation can take various forms, from changes in policy to shifts in how services are delivered. And while these changes may not be immediately visible, they play a role in shaping the environment in which individuals operate. For instance, changes in housing markets, employment structures, or social services can influence how individuals make decisions about their lives. And as these systems adjust to new patterns of behavior, they can either facilitate or hinder adaptation, depending on how well they align with the needs of the population. And this interaction between individual behavior and institutional response is a key factor in the overall trajectory of the shift. As we consider the long term implications, it becomes clear that the current transformation is not a single event, but an ongoing process that will continue to evolve as conditions change and as individuals and institutions respond to those changes. And while it is not possible to predict every outcome, it is possible to identify the underlying dynamics that are driving the process and to use that understanding to inform decisions. One of the most important aspects of this understanding is recognizing that change often involves a period of uncertainty where the old and the new coexist. And during this period, it is common for individuals to feel a sense of instability or ambiguity because the rules are not yet fully defined and the outcomes are not yet fully predictable. And navigating this period requires a combination of patience, awareness, and adaptability. At the same time, it is important to maintain a sense of agency because while the broader forces at play may be beyond individual control, the choices that individuals make within those conditions can still have a significant impact on their personal outcomes. And focusing on what can be controlled, such as personal development, financial management, and the cultivation of supportive relationships, can provide a foundation for stability even in a changing environment. As the new equilibrium begins to take shape, it will likely incorporate elements from both the past and the present, reflecting the lessons learned during this period of transition. And while it may not replicate previous systems, it will represent a configuration that is adapted to the current conditions. And understanding this process can help individuals align their expectations and strategies with the direction in which the system is moving. Ultimately, what we are witnessing is a reorganization of how people structure their lives and relate to each other in response to a changing set of conditions. And while this reorganization can be challenging, it also presents an opportunity to build systems and relationships that are more aligned with individual needs and more resilient in the face of future changes. And those who approach it with a willingness to learn and adapt are more likely to find ways to thrive within the evolving landscape. This is the deeper layer of the shift, not just a change in behavior, but a change in how people think about their lives, their goals, and their relationships. And as this new way of thinking becomes more widespread, it will continue to shape the direction of the system, influencing both individual decisions and collective outcomes in ways that will define the next phase of this transformation. As this transformation continues to stretch across time, another layer begins to emerge that is less visible at first, but becomes increasingly important as the shift deepens. And that layer is the recalibration of expectations around effort and reward, because for a long time, many people operated under an assumption that certain inputs would reliably produce certain outcomes. And while that was never perfectly accurate, it was consistent enough that people could structure their behavior around it. But as the environment changes, that relationship between effort and reward becomes less predictable. And when predictability decreases, people begin to question whether the effort required is still justified. This questioning is not necessarily driven by cynicism, but by a practical evaluation of outcomes, because when individuals invest time, energy, and resources into something, they naturally assess whether that investment is producing a return that aligns with their expectations. And if the return is inconsistent or uncertain, they may begin to redirect their efforts toward areas where the connection between input and outcome is more reliable. And this redirection is a key factor in understanding why behavior shifts at scale. In the context of relationships, this means that individuals may become more selective about where they invest their effort, focusing on situations that offer a clearer path to mutual benefit and stepping away from those that appear ambiguous or imbalanced. And this selectivity can reduce the overall level of engagement within the system because fewer people are willing to participate without a strong indication that their effort will be reciprocated or rewarded. As the selectivity becomes more common, it changes the dynamics of interaction because the threshold for engagement increases, and individuals may require more evidence of compatibility, reliability, or shared values before committing their time and energy. And while this can lead to more intentional and potentially more stable interactions, it can also slow down the formation of new connections because the process of evaluation becomes more rigorous. At the same time, the shift in expectations around effort and reward is influenced by the broader context of resource allocation because individuals have limited time, energy, and financial resources, and how they choose to allocate these resources reflects their priorities and their perception of where they will achieve the greatest return. And as the environment changes, these priorities may shift in ways that alter how individuals approach relationships and other areas of life. For example, if an individual perceives that investing in personal development, career advancement, or financial stability offers a more predictable and controllable return than investing in a relationship, they may prioritize those areas. And over time, this prioritization can become a default approach, particularly if it consistently produces positive outcomes. And this reinforces the behavior and makes it less likely that the individual will shift their focus without a compelling reason. This dynamic is further reinforced by the way in which individuals learn from experience, because past outcomes influence future decisions. And if previous attempts at engagement have not produced the desired results, individuals may adjust their behavior to avoid repeating those experiences. And this learning process is cumulative, meaning that each experience contributes to the overall pattern of behavior. And as more experiences are accumulated, the pattern becomes more defined. As these patterns become more established, they begin to influence not only individual behavior, but also the expectations that individuals have when entering new situations. Because expectations are shaped by past experiences. And if those experiences suggest that certain outcomes are unlikely, individuals may approach new interactions with a different mindset, one that is more cautious or more focused on self protection. And this mindset can influence how interactions unfold. Another important aspect of this shift is the role of comparison, because individuals often evaluate their own experiences in relation to others, and in an environment where information is widely shared, these comparisons can have a significant impact on perception, because individuals may see examples of both positive and negative outcomes and use these examples to inform their own expectations. And this can either reinforce or challenge their existing beliefs depending on what they observe. When negative examples are more prominent or more frequently discussed, they can contribute to a perception that certain outcomes are more common than they actually are. And this can lead to increased caution or reluctance to engage, because individuals may overestimate the likelihood of negative experiences. And this perception can influence behavior even if the actual probability of those outcomes is lower. On the other hand, positive examples can encourage engagement by demonstrating that desirable outcomes are possible. But for these examples to have a significant impact, they must be perceived as credible and attainable. And this depends on how they are presented and how they align with the individual's own experiences and expectations. And this interplay between perception and experience is a key factor in shaping behavior. As the system continues to evolve, the balance between these influences will play a role in determining how individuals approach engagement. Because if the perception of risk remains high and the perception of reward remains uncertain, the overall level of participation may remain lower than it was in previous conditions. And this has implications for how the system stabilizes over time. In addition to these behavioral dynamics, there is also an underlying shift in how individuals approach decision making more broadly. Because in an environment characterized by uncertainty, there is often a move toward strategies that emphasize optionality, meaning that individuals seek to maintain flexibility and avoid commitments that limit their ability to adapt to changing conditions. And this approach can be beneficial in managing risk, but it can also influence how relationships are formed and maintained. When individuals prioritize optionality, they may be less inclined to enter into arrangements that require a high level of commitment or that reduce their ability to adjust their circumstances. And this can lead to a preference for arrangements that are more flexible or that allow for greater independence. And while this can align with the desire for control and adaptability, it can also create challenges in building long term stability, because stability often requires a degree of commitment and consistency. This tension between flexibility and stability is a central theme in the current shift, because individuals must navigate the trade off between maintaining control over their circumstances and creating structures that provide long term security and support. And finding the right balance between these elements is a complex task that depends on individual priorities, risk tolerance, and the specific conditions they are operating within. As individuals experiment with different approaches to managing this tension, they contribute to the development of new norms and practices that reflect the realities of the environment. And over time, these practices may become more widely accepted and integrated into the broader system, shaping how future interactions are structured. Another factor that will influence the trajectory of this shift is the role of feedback mechanisms, because systems evolve through feedback, and the outcomes of individual decisions provide information that can be used to adjust behavior. And when feedback is clear and consistent, it can accelerate the process of adaptation by reinforcing effective strategies and discouraging ineffective ones. In the current context, feedback is being generated through a variety of channels, including personal experiences, social interactions, and the broader information environment. And this feedback is influencing how individuals evaluate their choices and adjust their behavior. And as more data points are accumulated, the patterns that emerge become more defined, providing a clearer picture of what is working and what is not. However, the interpretation of feedback is not always straightforward because individuals may have different perspectives or biases that influence how they understand the information they receive. And this can lead to different conclusions being drawn from similar experiences. And this variability can contribute to the diversity of responses that we see within the system. As the process continues, it is likely that some approaches will prove to be more effective than others in navigating the current environment. And these approaches may gain broader acceptance as individuals observe their outcomes and incorporate them into their own decision making. And this process of diffusion is a common way in which new norms and practices spread within a system. At the same time, it is important to recognize that no single approach will be universally applicable because individual circumstances and preferences vary, and what works for one person may not work for another. And this diversity of outcomes is a natural part of a system that is adapting to change. And understanding this can help individuals avoid the assumption that there is a one size fits all solution. As we move forward, the ongoing interaction between individual behavior, economic conditions, and social norms will continue to shape the evolution of the system. And while the specific details may change, the underlying dynamics will remain consistent because they are rooted in how individuals respond to incentives, manage risk, and seek to achieve their goals within the constraints of the environment. Ultimately, the key to navigating this landscape is to remain attentive to these dynamics and to use that awareness to inform decisions. Because while it is not possible to control all of the factors at play, it is possible to understand how they influence outcomes and to adjust behavior in ways that align with both current conditions and future possibilities. And this understanding provides a foundation for making choices that are both deliberate and adaptive in a time of ongoing change. As this progression continues to unfold across time and across people, another deeper realization begins to take shape, and that realization centers on the difference between systems that are sustained by obligation and systems that are sustained by voluntary participation. Because for a long time, many of the structures that govern relationships were reinforced by a mixture of expectation, tradition, and social pressure. And while those forces did not guarantee stability, they created a level of continuity that made participation feel like the default rather than a choice. But as those forces weaken, what remains is a system that depends much more heavily on voluntary engagement, and voluntary engagement operates under a very different set of rules. When participation becomes truly voluntary, it must be justified on an ongoing basis because individuals are no longer bound by external expectations to the same degree. And this means that the value of participation must be clear, consistent, and sufficient to motivate continued involvement. And if that value is not perceived, individuals will simply opt out, not necessarily with resistance or conflict, but with quiet disengagement. And this is one of the defining characteristics of the shift that is taking place. This transition from obligation to choice has profound implications because it raises the standard for what is considered acceptable or worthwhile. And it also increases the importance of alignment between individuals because without alignment, there is little incentive to remain engaged. And this places a greater emphasis on compatibility, shared goals, and mutual benefit as these factors become the foundation for sustained interaction. At the same time, this shift introduces a level of fragility into the system because voluntary participation can be withdrawn at any time if the conditions change or if the perceived value decreases. And this means that stability must be actively maintained rather than assumed. And maintaining stability requires continuous effort, communication, and adaptation from all parties involved. In practical terms, this changes how individuals approach relationships because instead of relying on predefined roles or expectations, they must actively define and negotiate the terms of their interaction. And this can lead to more customized and potentially more satisfying arrangements. But it also requires a higher level of engagement and responsibility because there is no external framework to fall back on if issues arise. This increased responsibility can be both empowering and challenging because it gives individuals more control over their interactions, but it also requires them to take a more active role in shaping those interactions, and not everyone is equally prepared or willing to do so. And this can lead to variation in how effectively different individuals navigate the system. Another consequence of the shift is the increased importance of self knowledge, because in order to engage effectively in a system based on voluntary participation, individuals must have a clear understanding of their own needs, preferences, and boundaries. And without this understanding, it is difficult to communicate effectively or to make decisions that lead to positive outcomes. And developing this level of self awareness is a process that takes time and reflection. As individuals become more self aware, they may also become more selective in their interactions because they are better able to identify what aligns with their goals and what does not. And this selectivity can lead to fewer but more intentional connections. And while this can improve the quality of interactions, it can also reduce the quantity, which has implications for how the system functions as a whole. At the same time, the move toward voluntary participation highlights the importance of reciprocity because, in the absence of obligation, the continuation of any interaction depends on both parties perceiving that they are receiving value. And this creates a dynamic where balance is essential because if one party feels that the exchange is uneven, they are more likely to disengage. And this makes reciprocity a central component of stability within the system. This focus on reciprocity can lead to a more transparent and accountable form of interaction because individuals are more attuned to whether their contributions are being matched. And this awareness can encourage more equitable behavior, but it can also lead to a more transactional perspective if not balanced with other considerations. And finding the right balance between these elements is an ongoing challenge. As this dynamic continues to evolve, it also influences how individuals perceive fairness. Because fairness is not a fixed concept, it is shaped by context and expectations. And as expectations change, so too does the perception of what is fair. And this can lead to differences in how individuals evaluate the same situation, depending on their perspective and their experience. These differences in perception can create tension, particularly when individuals operate under different assumptions about what constitutes a fair exchange. And resolving this tension requires communication and a willingness to understand the other perspective. But in a system where participation is voluntary, there is also the option to disengage rather than resolve the conflict. And this option can sometimes be chosen if the effort required to resolve the issue is perceived to be too high. Another layer of complexity arises from the interaction between individual preferences and broader societal trends. Because while individuals make decisions based on their own circumstances, those decisions are influenced by the environment in which they operate. And as the environment changes, it can either support or constrain certain choices. And this interplay shapes the overall pattern of behavior within the system. For example, if the broader environment supports independence and self sufficiency, individuals may find it easier to adopt those approaches because the necessary resources and opportunities are available, and this can reinforce the trend toward voluntary participation. But if the environment shifts in a way that makes interdependence more advantageous, this could influence behavior in a different direction. And this highlights the importance of context in understanding the trajectory of the system. As we consider the long term implications of this shift, it becomes clear that the transition to a system based on voluntary participation is not inherently negative or positive. It is simply different, and its outcomes will depend on how individuals and institutions adapt to the new conditions. And this adaptation will involve both challenges and opportunities as new patterns of interaction are developed and refined. One potential benefit of this transition is the opportunity for more authentic and intentional relationships, because when participation is voluntary, individuals are more likely to engage based on genuine interest and alignment rather than external pressure. And this can lead to interactions that are more meaningful and more satisfying. But achieving this outcome requires effort and a willingness to engage at a deeper level. At the same time, there is a risk that increased selectivity and the absence of obligation could lead to greater isolation for some individuals, particularly if they struggle to find or maintain connections that meet their criteria. And this highlights the importance of developing the skills and strategies needed to navigate a system where engagement is not guaranteed. As the system continues to evolve, it is likely that new norms and practices will emerge to support voluntary participation. And these norms may include clearer communication, more explicit agreements, and a greater emphasis on mutual benefit. And while these changes may take time to become established, they have the potential to create a framework that is better aligned with the current environment. At the same time, the transition will require individuals to adapt their expectations and their approach, because relying on previous assumptions may not produce the desired outcomes. And this adaptation involves both letting go of outdated models and embracing new ways of thinking about relationships and interaction. Ultimately, what we are witnessing is a shift toward a system where participation is driven by choice rather than obligation. And this shift changes the dynamics of interaction in fundamental ways, because it places greater emphasis on value, alignment, and reciprocity. And understanding these dynamics is essential for navigating the evolving landscape effectively. The key to operating within this system is to recognize that engagement must be earned and maintained through consistent and meaningful contribution, and that stability is not something that can be assumed, but something that must be actively cultivated. And this requires a proactive approach that is responsive to both personal needs and the broader context in which interactions take place. As this new framework continues to develop, it will shape how individuals approach relationships, how they define success, and how they structure their lives. And while the transition may be complex, it also offers the opportunity to create systems that are more aligned with individual values and more adaptable to changing conditions. And those who understand and engage with this process are more likely to find ways to thrive within it. As everything we have talked about begins to settle into place, the final layer of this situation comes into focus. And that layer is acceptance, not in the sense of giving up, but in the sense of recognizing reality for what it is without trying to reshape it into something more comfortable. Because one of the biggest obstacles people face during periods of change is not the change itself, but the resistance to acknowledging that the change has already happened. And that resistance keeps people mentally anchored to a version of the world that no longer exists, which makes it harder for them to adapt to the one that does. Acceptance does not mean agreement, and it does not mean approval. It simply means seeing clearly, because clarity is what allows you to make decisions that actually work in the environment you are in rather than the environment you wish you were in. And without that clarity, every move becomes reactive, every decision becomes delayed, and every outcome feels like something that happened to you instead of something you anticipated and prepared for. And that is where people lose ground, not because they are incapable, but because they are operating with outdated assumptions. What we are seeing right now is not just a shift in behavior or economics or relationships, it is a shift in reality itself at the level of how people interact, what they expect, and what they are willing to tolerate. And when reality shifts like that, there are only two options. You either adjust to it or you get dragged by it. And being dragged by it is where the frustration, the confusion, and the sense of helplessness start to build, because everything feels unpredictable when you are not aligned with the underlying patterns. The men who stepped away did not do it all at once, and they did not do it because of one single reason. They did it because over time, their experiences, their observations, and their calculations all pointed in the same direction. And when enough signals line up, the decision stops feeling like a risk and starts feeling like the only logical move. And once that decision is made and reinforced through better outcomes, it becomes very difficult to reverse because it is no longer theoretical, it is lived experience. At the same time, the response from the other side is not irrational either. Because when a system you relied on changes or disappears, the immediate reaction is to try to understand why and to look for ways to restore what was lost. And when those attempts do not produce results, the reaction can shift from confusion to frustration to urgency. And that urgency is what we are seeing expressed in different ways, sometimes through questions, sometimes through complaints, sometimes through attempts to re engage a system that is no longer functioning in the same way. The problem is that restoration requires alignment, and alignment requires both sides to see value in returning to a previous structure. And right now, that alignment does not exist because the incentives have changed, the expectations have changed, and the perceived risks and rewards have changed. And without addressing those underlying factors, there is no mechanism that will naturally pull things back to where they were, because people do not move backward into situations they believe are not in their best interest. This is where the conversation often gets stuck, because people focus on surface level solutions without addressing the deeper dynamics, and surface level solutions might create temporary movement, but they do not create lasting change, because lasting change comes from shifting the incentives and the perceptions that drive behavior. And until those shift, the patterns we are seeing will continue, regardless of how much people talk about them. What makes this moment different from previous periods of tension is that the withdrawal we are seeing is quiet and widespread at the same time. And that combination is powerful because it is not something that can be negotiated with or debated in a traditional sense. It is a collective outcome of individual decisions that are being made independently, but in parallel, and that makes it more resilient to external pressure because there is no single point of influence that can reverse it. At the same time, the economic backdrop adds another layer of pressure because it removes the buffer that once allowed people to ignore or delay addressing underlying issues. And when the cost of living rises and resources become tighter, the margin for inefficiency disappears, and people are forced to make decisions that are more closely aligned with their immediate needs and long term stability. And this accelerates the shift because it pushes individuals to act rather than wait. And this is why the situation feels like it is intensifying, because multiple forces are moving in the same direction at the same time. Social dynamics, economic pressure, and individual behavior are all reinforcing each other. And when that happens, change does not just continue, it compounds. And that compounding effect is what makes the current moment feel different from anything that came before it. And here's the part that most people are not ready to hear, because it requires letting go of the idea that this is temporary. This is not a phase that will simply pass. It is a recalibration that is already underway. And while the final shape of it is still forming, the direction is clear enough that waiting for things to go back to how they were is not a strategy, it is a delay. And delays come with a cost, because the longer you wait to adjust, the fewer options you have when you finally decide to move. This is where personal responsibility comes back into focus, not as a slogan, but as a practical necessity. Because regardless of how you feel about the broader situation, you still have to operate within it. And operating within it effectively requires understanding it. And understanding it requires stepping back from the noise and looking at the patterns that are actually driving outcomes, not the narratives that are being repeated around them. Once you see those patterns, your approach changes, because you stop expecting the system to behave in ways that it no longer does. And you start making decisions based on what is actually happening. And that shift alone can make a significant difference, because it moves you from a reactive position to a proactive one, where you are anticipating outcomes rather than being surprised by them. This does not mean that everything becomes easy or predictable, because uncertainty is still part of the environment, but it does mean that you are better positioned to navigate that uncertainty, because you are working with the system instead of against it. And that alignment reduces friction, which in turn makes it easier to maintain stability even when conditions are challenging. At the same time, it is important to recognize that adaptation is not about abandoning everything that came before. It is about integrating what still works with what needs to change, because not every element of the previous system is obsolete. Some of it still holds value, but that value needs to be applied in a way that fits the current context, and that requires discernment, because you have to be able to separate what is still useful from what is no longer effective. This process of integration is where new opportunities begin to emerge, because when you are not tied to a single way of doing things, you can combine elements from different approaches to create something that is more aligned with your needs and the environment you are operating in. And this flexibility is a strength, because it allows you to adapt without losing direction. As more individuals go through this process, the collective outcome begins to take shape, and that shape will not be identical to what existed before, but it will reflect the adjustments that have been made, the lessons that have been learned, and the priorities that have shifted. And while it may not satisfy everyone, it will represent a new balance that is grounded in the realities of the current moment. And that is the point where the conversation needs to move away from trying to restore the past and toward understanding the present, because the present is where decisions are made, and those decisions are what shape the future. And if those decisions are based on an accurate understanding of the environment, they are more likely to produce outcomes that are stable and sustainable. So the real question is not whether things have changed, because they already have. The real question is whether you are going to acknowledge that change and adjust accordingly, or whether you are going to continue operating as if the old rules still apply and deal with the consequences that come from that mismatch. And that is a decision that each individual has to make for themselves. Because at the end of the day, no one is coming to reset the system for you. No one is going to roll things back to a previous state, and no one is going to step in and remove the need for you to adapt. And that might sound harsh, but it is also freeing, because it means that your outcomes are not dependent on waiting for something external to change. They are dependent on how you choose to respond to what is already happening. And that brings everything back to the same place, which is awareness, because awareness is the starting point for every adjustment, every decision, and every outcome. And without it, you are guessing. But with it, you have a framework that you can use to navigate even when the path is not completely clear. So, what do you do with all of this? You take a step back, you look at your own situation honestly, you identify where your assumptions no longer match reality, and you start making changes that bring those two things into alignment, and you do it consistently. Not all at once, but step by step, because that is how real adaptation happens, not through sudden transformation, but through steady adjustment. And as you do that, you will start to see the difference, not immediately, but over time, because your decisions will begin to produce outcomes that are more in line with your expectations, and that alignment creates stability, and stability creates clarity, and clarity makes everything else easier to navigate. Shout out to the 2 Hour Gang. Now, I want to hear from you because this is not a one sided conversation. What did you think about what we discussed? Do you agree with what is happening, or do you see it differently? And more importantly, how are you adapting to it? Because your perspective adds to the conversation and helps others see angles they might not have considered. So leave a comment and share your thoughts. Like the video if you like it. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.